Thank you so much for being with us this morning. And I'm going to turn it over to Jamie so that we can get started.
All right, thank you, Ilya. So welcome, everyone. I'm Jamie Freed. I'm Director of Adult Services here at the Asperger Autism Network. We just changed our name, so I paused a little bit on that. And this is Know Your Brand of Asperger's or Related Autism Spectrum Profile. We're really excited to welcome all of you, and I find this really interesting how where people are from. So I just want to let you all know that we have people here from Maine, New York, Florida, California, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Virginia, Vermont, Georgia, New Hampshire, New Mexico, Iowa, Massachusetts, and also from England. So thank you all for joining us. We're really glad that you're here with us today. So I always like to start with this, and many of you may have heard this. Oh, I also want to say that this presentation is really, it's an introductory kind of overview of Asperger Syndrome and related autism spectrum profiles. It's essentially designed for adults on the spectrum. I know the whole crew here is not a group of adults, so just keep that in mind as I'm talking. And also, this is a picture of Stephen Shore. He actually was a past board president of what used to be the Aspergers Association of New England. He's an author, he's a professor, a musician, and an adult on the spectrum. And he's the first person I heard this quote from, so I attribute it to him. When you meet one person with Asperger syndrome, you've met one person with Asperger syndrome. I think I always start with that because it's important to keep in mind when we do presentations, we often make generalizations and things like that. And just be aware that every person is obviously unique and needs to be thought about that way. And so the plan for the day is I'm going to review some facts about Asperger syndrome or related autism spectrum profiles. When I refer, I probably will just naturally refer to it as Asperger syndrome or AS. I'm really talking about autism spectrum disorder, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, social communication disorder. There's all sorts of names, but I'm talking about this particular sort of end of the autism spectrum. And I'll probably just refer to it as Asperger's or AS. So we're going to review the attributes of AS, the challenges and the strengths. We're going to do some polls and exercises, hopefully to keep you engaged. And there's a few videos embedded, which is new for me, so bear with me on that. And I hope that there will be some things that you take away from this presentation. I know when I go to workshops, even if I'm really kind of into the information as I'm hearing it, I walk away and remember about 3 things. So, I'm hoping you will take away 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 pointers from this workshop. And we're hoping to have time for questions and answers. So here's the first poll. Please let us know if you identify as an adult on the spectrum, a parent of an adult, a sibling of an adult, a professional working with adults, or other.
So right now, yeah, we'll just take a few seconds for you to click on the right response, and we'll show you the results once I see that most people have voted.
Okay, so it looks like we are a little over 50% adults, about 29% parents, 4% siblings, 7% professionals, and 14% other. I'm wondering what I didn't ask about.
Spouse.
Spouse. Oh my gosh, I completely forgot. It was meant to be there. So yes, thank you. And second, I want to ask about if you could respond to this. Are you 18 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50? You can see 50 to 60, 60 to 80, or over 80. And okay. So I really wanted to ask this as well, because I want to let everyone know it is never too late to sort of learn about Asperger's. there's a group that I've run here for a while, and there's someone in the group who got his diagnosis just before his 70th birthday, and he's now 81. And in this last decade, it's been so useful for him to kind of learn about himself and how Asperger's has impacted his life, and it's really been incredibly helpful. But at any age, it's just never too late to increase your self-understanding and self-knowledge. So thank you for responding to that. So
I want to make sure that you're seeing the screen change. Sometimes when we go in and out of the polls, it's a little odd, but if it's just one or two people can just chat in and say, yes, I see about Asperger Syndrome slide on top. Yep, great, thank you.
Okay, so we're good?
We're good.
All right, so briefly I want to just, the history is that there was a psychiatrist in Vienna in the 1940s in World War II, during World War II, named Hans Asperger, who was studying a group of boys who had the characteristics that we're going to talk about today. And he identified this group. He called it autistic psychopathy. He was describing people with what we call Asperger syndrome or a variety of other things. And the hospital where he worked was bombed. The paper was lost. It resurfaced in, I think it was 1979, in England, where it was translated into English, and where people began to talk about Asperger syndrome and naming it obviously after Hans Asperger at that point. But it didn't get here to the U.S. Until 1994 officially, when it was part of the DSM-4. Which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And so that's where it became, an official diagnosis. It was actually called Asperger disorder, but we really don't like to use the disorder word, very much. So, it became an official diagnosis in 94. Some of you may know that, and I'm not really going to spend time on this today. I'm just going to mention it, that in the DSM-5, which just came out in May, it's not officially a diagnosis anymore. It's now autism spectrum disorder. So it's neurological. It's not a mental illness. It's hardwired. I had a group the other night of actually folks 50 and over with Asperger's, and there was some discussion about whether or not this is a mental illness or not. And people really feel like, no, this is hardwired in. This is how you are. It's not something you acquire, and it's a developmental delay. I think this is very helpful to think about, because it means that things can come later, things that you don't learn, earlier or at the same time as your peers. It's okay. It may take longer. It may be slower. You may not sort of get everywhere that everybody else is, but in some ways, people on the spectrum are way ahead of other people, and in some ways, they're delayed. My colleague here, Erica Dresner, says, throw away the yardstick, and I think that's just very helpful, because comparing yourself to other folks who are neurologically wired differently in a more sort of typical way, they're going to be sort of moving along and developing at a different pace. So I think just keeping in mind the developmental delay is helpful. It is on the spectrum. Autism spectrum disorder is what is in the DSM-5. But in the DSM-4, it was under the umbrella of pervasive developmental disorder. And I really like that term personally because of the word pervasive. I think it's really important to know, people talk about it as mild autism or, high functioning. Well, maybe in some ways, but there's really nothing mild about it when it touches so many areas, and we're going to get into those areas. So I think it's really important to sort of give it that recognition. The prevalence of autism, the recent numbers, I think from the CDC, are 1 in 68, and the gender breakdown is said to be 4 to 1 males to females. We really think that that's underreported in women, that women mask the traits better, that they are more socialized, societally. And but the 4-to-1 breakdown actually matches what's in our database here at AANE, and I'm not going to talk any more about the DSM-5. So this is called Know Your Brand of Asperger's. So I should say you're not really going to come out with an actual brand like any of these Lego or Amtrak or Magic Cards or Apple. It's really just that if you have Asperger syndrome or are on the autism spectrum, diagnosed or not, any of it, we all need to know kind of what makes us tick. And if you're on the spectrum, it's important to know, well, what is it? We get calls from a lot of people who say, I got diagnosed, but I have no idea what this is. Can you help me? Can you tell me what this is? What am I supposed to do now? So it's really important to know what Asperger's is and what particular aspects of it relate to you and when, because, there may be some environments where you're more sensitive and other environments where you're really comfortable. And so the traits don't come out as much. So it's just really important to know what it is and what attributes apply to you. The other reason to know your particular brand, in quotes, of Asperger's is to validate your current and past reality. Not to pathologize, not to say, oh, this is what's wrong with me. It's really just to say, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. This is why I've struggled in these ways, and this is why I'm really good at these things. So to increase your self-understanding. And to forgive yourself for past difficulties. The person I talked about who's, 81, it's really helped him to look back and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I was dealing with all of this when I was trying to get a college degree. No wonder it took me 20 years to do that. And there's a way to sort of cognitively retell sort of your experience. So the other thing is it's helpful to sort of say, oh, my parents didn't know what they were dealing with, or they didn't know what they were looking at. They thought I was just misbehaving. They didn't know that I was completely overloaded. So it can be a helpful way to forgive others for not understanding you. It's also important to know, because you can't advocate for yourself if you kind of don't know what's making you tick. So for self-advocacy, to increase your ability to explain yourself to others and to strategically disclose. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but I'll just say that for strategic disclosure, you don't have to 100% disclose to everybody all the time, I have Asperger syndrome or whatever the label is. It's important to tell people what they need to know for the particular relationship that you have with them. So you can kind of tailor it that way. So let's get into what the attributes are. And there's several slides that just have a list of attributes. I do start with the challenges, and there are significant challenges, but don't dismay. We move into the strengths as well, and they're equally important to recognize. So the first attribute is theory of mind. That's essentially perspective taking, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to hear where someone's coming from. This varies a lot. Back to Stephen Shore's slide, when you've met one person, you've met one person. It varies a lot from person to person. And when people are calm and comfortable, it's, you can get other people's perspectives. And, so say in a meeting at work or in a relationship, if you're really comfortable, you might be able to tune into where someone else is coming from. If you're not, it's very possible you will have be really frustrated and just only see things from your own perspective. And it varies from person to person. Some people really are challenged by this theory of mind, perspective taking, and other people less so. But it is a core feature of Asperger's. Central coherence is that people on the spectrum tend to be really detail-oriented, which can be actually really great in certain jobs, like research jobs or, accountants, things like that. People really can be focused on details. Sometimes this is what's referred to as, missing the forest for the trees, and, seeing the trees. And as Michael Wilcox, who's a self-advocate and person on the spectrum says, seeing the bark and the dirt and all the little molecules around it and not seeing the whole big forest. So is that folks with Asperger's, get a lot of the details, the facts, if there's a connect the dots, you see all the dots, but not the lines in between, which is what in some cases makes sense out of the dots, the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions. And so sometimes those things are missed, but the facts are picked up. And sensory sensitivities, I want to say really strongly, don't underestimate sensory sensitivities. People have this is something that people do neurologically mature. A lot of the adults we talk to will say, oh my gosh, I remember I used to dive under desks during the fire drill in school. But now it's just mildly uncomfortable for me. I try to avoid it, but it doesn't bother me. I can tolerate it. I'm not going to run away. But sensory sensitivities come in all sorts of, forms. We have a lot of senses, right? So noise, light, textures, tastes, smell, and people can be really hypersensitive to all sorts of things. And this is one of those things that I think folks on the spectrum they might know about themselves, they might not know about themselves, and just not know why they're sort of really upset about something. And it could be that there's a sensory sort of assault going on that they don't even know about, or that they do know about, and feel foolish, saying I can't tolerate fluorescent lights or whatever. For example, fluorescent lights, that's something that some people can see the cycling of a fluorescent light and hear the buzz. And so, they're expected to pay attention to someone talking, but really, I think people on the spectrum don't pay attention. I think what's happening is people on the spectrum are paying attention to everything. They can't filter it out. There's background and foreground get kind of mixed, and other people don't understand that, and it makes it really difficult. Executive functioning refers to organizational abilities, the ability to manage time, to organize, prioritize, sequence, manage tasks, clutter, breaking big projects down into small steps. Executive functioning governs what we do every day, all day, every day, from the time we get up to the time we go to bed. Getting out of bed, showering, getting dressed. Showering. I saw somebody do a presentation, person on spectrum, and she broke down showering into something like 39 steps. And I know a lot of folks on the spectrum would be like, that's ridiculous. Of course, I can just hop in the shower and do that. It's true, but for some people, they have to actually kind of think about like, okay, is this a day? Do I wash my hair? There's just lots and lots of steps, and managing the sensory issues of being pelted by water, which might actually hurt. So there's just a lot. And then, needing to choose clothes, making the decision. And, it might be some clothes that are uncomfortable. So there's just a lot that goes into all day, every day, and it's exhausting. So by the time people walk out their door in the morning, they're pretty much exhausted already. This also applies to work or school projects, not being able to necessarily know how much information is needed, what's important, and what the order is, what order to do something. We know someone that got a job at a small museum, and he was really an expert on this museum, knew everything about it, but was given just a pile of paperwork to do and didn't do it, and also didn't know to ask for help or just do it. He just didn't do it, and so he ended up 3 months later getting fired because he hadn't really done his job, even though he really, with the right supports, could have done a great job. Social communication, this is also a big feature for folks on the spectrum. So as you can see from this, body language accounts for 55% of total communication. That's gestures and smiling and body position and eye contact. And one thing I want to say about eye contact is, people think you're not paying attention if you don't give eye contact. Well, I know a number of people that will say, do you want me to look or do you want me to listen? I can't do both at the same time. That eye contact is overwhelming. And so people get misunderstood in that way based on the nonverbal communication that they're actually giving off. They also have a hard time interpreting nonverbal communication. So as you see from this, nonverbal communication, body language, and tone of voice, the prosody of the voice, rise and fall, the, how loud or soft someone's speaking, accounts for 93% of communication. Verbal, the words that we say, accounts for 7%. That's the piece of communication that folks on the spectrum are best at, which means that 93% of communication is something that people have to work really hard to understand. So here's some more attributes. Motor skills are often impacted, not for everyone, but gross and fine motor skills. Folks on the spectrum tend not to be great at team sports. This isn't particularly just the motor skill piece. This is also the social piece. You have to connect with others. You need to make eye contact. You need to organize if you're going to be playing soccer, and where are you supposed to be on the field in relation to other people. But people often excel at individual sports, cross country, skiing, swimming, things like that. People tend to can be really good at. But some people actually, their gross motor skills are delayed. A lot of people struggle with low tone, hypotonia, and that makes gross motor things more difficult. Fine motor skills are often a challenge. Teachers will complain that they absolutely cannot read people's writing. Well, it's because people's hands were not designed to write, some people. And, thank goodness for computers. I heard, someone who does a lot of presentations for us, Lynn Mitchell, talks about, you have to be able to write a check and fill out a job application. And now I'm not even sure that's true for job applications, but you probably should be able to sign a check. Beyond that, you can probably manage with keyboarding, and thank goodness for that. Low body awareness. This refers to people, often people aren't tuned into other people. Well, often people on the spectrum are not tuned into themselves and their own bodies and their own needs, when they're hungry, when they need to go to the bathroom, and I'm sure there's a lot of eyes rolling at that. People will be like, of course I know that, but I know that people, will get caught up in something and just not attend to their own sort of needs of their own body. I know a woman who went hiking and, became dehydrated and really had no idea that this was happening, and she ended up becoming very sick. This doesn't mean she doesn't go hiking anymore. It means that she knows she doesn't tune into that, and so she makes sure to use a watch or whatever, a phone probably, to make sure that she's drinking regularly so that she doesn't get dehydrated and that she can continue to do something that she loves. Nonverbal communication, I kind of covered this, but it's also that folks on the spectrum may not use the sort of typical nonverbal signals to other people, and so they get misunderstood for that reason, in addition to not being able to pick up nonverbal communication. There's also a percentage of folks on the spectrum that are face blind, that actually don't recognize faces. So they learn all sorts of tricks to know who's who in their lives. And, if someone pulls their hair back or is out of context, it's really hard for them to recognize that person. And it's really socially not great, because if you see somebody that's like a really good friend, at the grocery store, and you act like they're a stranger, they're, if they don't know that you're face blind, they're really not going to understand, and they're going to be offended. So it's probably best to sort of let people know if you don't recognize faces. Processing speed, officially, I think on neuropsych testing, refers to how quickly the information gets from your brain down your arm to a piece of paper. That's what I was told. But I think of processing speed, that the impact is a lot greater, that the world just moves too fast, that conversations with multiple people are really, really complicated. For folks on the spectrum who are dealing with anxiety, which is most people, if you're in a conversation with multiple people and you think, oh, I got something to say, and you start sort of rehearsing it in your head and wait for an opening in the conversation, and it's possible that when you dive in to kind of say the thing that you're going to say, that the conversation has moved on and that the group sort of looks at you like, wait, you're done with that topic, which really contributes to people feeling badly about themselves and also being misunderstood. So let's see, there's a tendency to be somewhat rigid, black and white thinking. It's important to kind of build in shades of gray, and words like always and never crop up a lot in people's conversation. It would be good to add words like, well, this might happen, or this could happen. Maybe it won't be so bad. But people have to do that cognitively because for folks on the spectrum, many people, their brains will go to the extreme of, something bad happens and it can connect like train cars to all the other kind of bad things that have happened in the past and lead to, people feeling really badly. People tend to be perfectionistic, not everybody, again. And, that can look like having an assignment to do or a job to do at work, and where you can spend, 30 hours on a 3-hour, what should be maybe a 3 or 4 hour job. And, because you can't have any errors. And but the other thing that perfectionism can look like is sitting on the couch doing nothing. And that's because people can be so paralyzed because what they're, they know it's not going to be perfect. They can't even get started. So there's a lot of inertia. So it's really important to sort of understand that and figure out, okay, tell yourself things like, it'll be okay. I just need to get started. I might need to get help with what the first step is and get going on things. So people also tend to like predictability. It's very hard to shift if you have a plan for a work day, for example, and you come in and you know exactly what you're going to do. And then your boss says, okay, it's an all hands on deck day. So probably for someone on the spectrum, they might actually be thinking of a boat at that point, and which is, not the case, but but there are some, people that sort of think literally. So, you're sort of thinking like all hands on deck, what's that? Even if you know what the term means. And then you're sort of forced to work with other people on a project that you didn't expect to do. And it's really hard to just shift without any forward knowledge. So predictability, routine, desire for sameness, those are all really important for folks on the spectrum. It doesn't mean that things need to be exactly the same. Some people actually like things to be kind of mixed up, but they just know what to know what to expect. There is a significant amount of anxiety for most people on the spectrum, and why not? It's really stressful when you don't know kind of what sensory assaults are waiting for you, each day, social demands, executive functioning demands. It's just hard to sort of relax. So there's a fair amount of anxiety because you need to be on guard for all of those kind of things. And there's also a significant amount of depression. People struggle with friendship and relationships and employment, and of course, struggling in all those significant areas is going to lead to people not feeling so great about themselves. And actually, in some cases, clinical depression. So it's all absolutely exhausting. People on the spectrum, I have to say, are just brave every day to go out their door and engage in the world that's, sort of not built for folks on the spectrum. But, that's something we're working on. We're trying to change that and educate people. And I hope that people, sort of take pride in the strength that, you're up against a lot, but we're getting to the strengths too. And now we're going to move on to strengths. So folks on the spectrum have average to above average intelligence, and which is, which is great actually, and very helpful, and very people get a lot of joy out of the things that they know a lot about, and which moves us on to deep interests, which I call deep interests. There's a woman named Valerie Parody. She wrote Elijah's Cup, and she doesn't like the term special interest because it feels like it's sort of like special, like off to the side kind of, as opposed to something that's really deep and within someone. So I use that term. And the deep interests, people have bring great joy. Sometimes people get over focused on them, but it's not something to get rid of. It's something to, if it gets in the way of functioning, sure, you need to manage it. But, for some people, it's led them into careers or friendships or hobbies. And it's a great way to actually counteract some of the difficulties. And for the most part, folks that, are not on the spectrum in adulthood, they lose that, maybe something that they would be into, something deeply in childhood, but then kind of lose that passion. The folks on the spectrum that I know don't lose that passion. They continue to really be interested in things throughout their life. We have a lot of folks in the community who are writers, who are artists. We have an artist collaborative here. We have a gallery in our office, actually. Incredible artists, mathematicians, engineers, people that are interested in Japanese animation and manga, sports statistics, all sorts of things, history. There's just people that are, experts in everything. And I would say, value that. It's really, it's great. Don't let it get in the way of functioning. But, if you can kind of pair that with friendships or a career or job, that's great. Find other people who are like-minded and interested in the same thing, and you may find some really good friends. People tend to be honest. That's a great quality. Sometimes people tend to be honest to a fault. And so that's something that folks on the spectrum kind of need to learn is, if someone, like, for example, one of the things I was thinking last night actually was about birthday presents. I mean, that's always kind of an issue when you give somebody on the spectrum a birthday present. First of all, most people don't like surprises. I know Tony Atwood, who wrote that book, Understanding Aspergers, that I think Hank was reading, said, what's the worst thing? He asked somebody he was working with, what is the worst thing that can happen to you? And they said surprise. That surprise was the worst thing that could happen. And so a lot of people, when they get birthday presents and they don't know what they're going to get, they get it. And it's really hard to be like appreciative and excited, especially if it's something you really can't stand or smells or whatever. It's just, so anyway, it's one of those things that it's important to kind of learn to say, thank you for thinking of me or something like that. So, you don't seem completely ungrateful, if you get something. And it's also helpful for other people to understand, like, maybe I should give this person exactly what they want because they'll be really, really excited, even if they know to expect it. So, another example is if somebody, cooks dinner for someone and goes to the trouble of spending hours cooking dinner for somebody, and then they say, how do you like the dinner? And what if you didn't like it? Well, it's probably best to figure out a way to sort of say that, you really appreciate the effort and you liked it, even if you didn't. But, other than that, being honest is a great quality, and it's refreshing, and we don't see enough of it, I think, in our society today. So integrity, I think people on the spectrum tend to have a lot of integrity, strong sense of social justice and right and wrong. That's also incredible. We need people to step out and say when they see something that's not right. A lot of people, whistleblowers tend to be folks that might be on the spectrum because they see something that's not right. They need to speak out about it. Part of the problem with that is often they'll do it alone and make themselves really vulnerable instead of sort of gathering other people together, because that's a social thing and that's really hard to do. And you have to communicate. So it's hard to, anyway, so you have to be careful if you're going to sort of speak out. Just make sure you're not, completely vulnerable. But at the same time, don't stop doing it. And it's really, really important and helps us make progress. So people tend to be really sincere. People tend to have a really good sense of humor. It might be different. I think there are probably a lot of comedians that actually might have Asperger's. I don't really know this, but comedians they sort of observe life from a distance and comment on really weird and quirky things that people do, kind of normal things that people do in their everyday life, and say, like, what is up with that? So I think, and wordplay among folks on the spectrum is incredible, because I think, people are just really good verbally. And so lots of puns and things like that. Our groups can be like hysterical, because people are so funny, and smart and quick. And people tend to be really persistent and not give up if it's something that they really want. And that's also a really great quality. It is hard to be persistent in the face of challenges, and, in the face of a world that maybe doesn't understand. And some additional strengths. So people may be gifted, and this is something that people struggle with, because, not everybody is gifted. Not everybody has deep interests. And then that, even in the Asperger community, makes people feel badly about themselves. Like, well, I don't have a gift. I'm not a savant. Well, most people aren't savants. I know somebody that actually, when he told people he had Asperger's, they would say, well, what can you do? And so he learned to say the alphabet backwards, so he would have something he could do that was, sort of clever. And, but, it's okay if you're not gifted. And on the other hand, many people are. People tend to have excellent memories, incredible memories. This can be a wonderful thing, because you can easily sort of like remember a really wonderful time, something that made you happy, an interest, or carry something that reminds you of something that you love. The flip side of that is that people can remember things that, from a very, very long time ago, that were very upsetting. And what happens often is that they can sort of go right back to that time. It's not a flashback, but it's sort of a, someone stole lunch money from me in third grade, and, you can see that the emotions will like come back. And so that's something we need to sort of be aware of and guard against. Folks tend to be logical, which is great also, and not just accept things, you need to do this because you need to do this. Well, why do I need to do it? It's important to know why, and rely on logic. And because people are so bright, they tend to have the ability to learn cognitively what other people do intuitively. So this takes a lot of work. And it may, contribute to the sort of developmental delay, like things take longer. But people use their average to above average intelligence to learn to do what other people do intuitively. And I'm not saying that the goal here is for people on the spectrum to try to be people not on the spectrum. That, at least for me, and from my organization, that's not the goal. It's to understand yourself, to be able to function the best that you can. But it's not to become what some people call neurotypical. I call non-spectrum. I'm not a fan of the word neurotypical, so I thought I'd just share that. Just means people aren't on the spectrum. I don't really know that there's a neurotypical. So, and people tend to be really, really interesting and really fascinating, and talk about things that mean something, not so much small talk. So I talked about in the beginning having, you know what? There's an exercise. I'm not sure what our time is like.
We're at 5 to 11, so we're doing well.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's an exercise which you can kind of just do yourself, I think. Think of a couple of AS-related challenges that you experience, and if you want to write them down. And think of a couple of strengths that you have, or the person that you are, your loved one that you're sort of listening to this for. This is not a poll. We're just want you to do that for yourselves. And then things to keep in mind. This is what I talked about. I want to sort of circle back. I ran through all of the traits pretty quickly, the challenges, the strengths, and I want to highlight a few of them, circle back, because things that I'd like you to sort of take with you, I think, that I've learned over the years from a number of people who I've seen present. So there's a neuropsychologist actually here in the Boston area named Miles Tarter, and he's the first person I heard this term from, expectation gap. And the expectation gap is created because, what we just talked about, the split on the neuropsych testing, that people are so bright, and people, that's what people see. People see folks on the spectrum. Sometimes you can tell something's different, and sometimes you can't. It can be an invisible, hidden disability, and so you don't get cut any slack. If people sort of see you as this like really bright person, then it's sort of common, like, you're so smart. How can you possibly, and, fill in the blank, not get these social cues, or, not get to stop talking about your interest, or various things. So there's just this expectation gap, and people don't get cut a break because they can't, because you can't see it. So, and there's someone I know who talks about feeling like they have two brains, that one is just really, zipping along, competent, really good at certain things, and the other one that's just weighted down and really, really struggling. And that's very stressful, to feel like you have two brains in one head. So social pragmatics, that's the social use of language. And Elsa Avile is a speech therapist, also local here in Boston. And, she talks about conversational hierarchy. So it's important to know that conversations have a beginning and a middle and an end, how much time to talk, when you ask a question, when you sort of pick up a thread from someone said, and, when to close the conversation. And when someone is, that... Anyway, it's just exhausting. Conversations tend to be kind of exhausting because there's a lot of, you need to think about that cognitively as opposed to, just naturally getting it. And then code switching is something that's also really important to know, because if you're getting together with people that share your interests, you're going to, I don't know if people are familiar with meetup.com, but that's a place where people with shared interests, you meet online initially, and then you get together in person. So there can be, an astronomy meetup. If you get together with people in an astronomy meetup, it's fine to talk about astronomy. You don't really need to ask about their kids. You don't need to check in with them, make sure they're okay, how they're feeling. You can just go right to talking about astronomy. That's fine. But if you go to work at an office, then you can't just keep talking about astronomy. So you need to sort of be able to code switch. What can you talk about in what environments? And so I have up here, a picture of an office, and pizza and game night at AANE, where it's fine to just kind of talk about, find people that are interested in what you're interested in, and it's okay not to make eye contact all the time, and it's okay to just sort of be out there with your Aspergers. But you need to know which environments you need to be one way or the other in. So again, sensory sensitivities. I cannot underestimate the importance of these. So there's on the top right here is the ziggurat model. It's a pyramid. And on the base of that pyramid, so this is set up for, how do you teach skills to someone? Well, the base of that pyramid is sensory and biological. If people's sensory issues are not taken care of, and they're not comfortable, it doesn't have to be perfectly comfortable, but if you're uncomfortable, you're probably not going to be ready to learn. And so that's the base of the pyramid. So that needs to be taken care of first before all other things. And I think that gets missed and overlooked. And I include this other, so the Haynes commercial from the 1970s, which I happen to remember actually, but Teresa Bolick, who's a psychologist in New Hampshire, I remember when I saw her speak and I thought, oh, that's cute and funny. And then I realized, so the slogan is, you can't think right if your underwear is too tight. And I thought, okay, for me, that makes me remember, like, always that you need to really be aware of sensory issues. It's really, really important. And So I hope you take that away from today. And more on sensory, Alex Michaels' sensory budget. So Alex Michaels is an adult on the spectrum. She's written an article on something called the sensory budget. And essentially it talks about knowing the cost of your daily activities and know what replenishes you and that you may need more downtime. So, and I put a link actually to the article. So she actually, I don't know if she still does this, but she used to assign points to everything that she did every day. And so if she went to the grocery store, so anticipating the day, and she gave herself 100 points. So say going to the grocery store cost 8 points, but she unexpectedly ran into somebody and that cost about 12 points, or the thing that she was looking for wasn't there. And then that she was up to maybe 20 points. And then what if the person she ran into, she didn't like them? Well, that's 30 points right there. She's only got 70 left, and it's only 9 in the morning. So, obviously it's not that simple, but to her, because she couldn't kind of tell if she was getting stressed out or overloaded, she would use this point system. And when she was getting up to close to 100, or hopefully before that, she would do things that replenished her. And I think that Alex is into bridges. So I put a picture of a bridge because, if you look at a picture of something you really like, or think about something you like, or take a break, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you might do to feel better. So anyway, it's just another way of thinking about sensory issues. So another video, this is Temple Grandin, who says, what would happen if autism genes were eliminated from the gene pool? And I'm going to let Temple answer. Oh, Temple Grandin, let me just say who she is in case you don't know. She's probably the most famous person in the world with autism Asperger's. She is, renowned author, and but she says this is her side job. Her main job is that she's a large animal veterinarian. She designed more humane ways for cattle to go to slaughter. She understands cattle way better than people, although she's getting pretty good with people now. But many slaughterhouses in the United States are using her design because it's just so much more humane, and the cattle are calmer, and apparently the meat's better. And so anyway, she's incredible, but she does a lot of speaking. So if you ever get a chance to see her or any of the other people I'm mentioning, please do. So it's just really short.
Well, it's really great to be here today. Lots of things to talk about today in a pretty short period of time. And I think I'll just start out talk about, what exactly autism is. It's a developmental disorder. It's a very, very big continuum. Now, the thing is, when does something of just normal variation become an abnormality? For example, people with bipolar have more siblings in creative careers, and people with autism have more relatives in technical careers. If we got rid of all of the genetics that makes autism, well, you wouldn't even have any computers. You wouldn't have any electricity. I mean, who do you think made the first stone spear? It wasn't the social yakety-yaks around the campfire, that's for sure.
All right, yeah, so it wasn't the social yakety-yaks around the campfire. Thanks, Temple. I love that it's true that, we need people who think differently, who create, who see outside the box, or as some people say, what box? But anyway, we wouldn't make progress if people didn't think differently and take risks and create, and, if people were afraid to speak up, or just blindly followed others, which I think, a lot of people do. So I think, her point is well taken. So I want to talk about anxiety. This is Tony Attwood, who, when there was only one book on the market about Asperger Syndrome, which was called Asperger Syndrome, it was by Tony Attwood. And he's from Australia, and lives in Australia. Anyway, so what he says about anxiety is that when someone gets anxious, their IQ drops 30 points. And I don't know what that means in terms of like how anxious someone has to be, but I think this is just the first time I heard it, I was sort of stunned by this, that, you get anxious, your IQ drops 30 points. And if you get angry, your IQ drops 60 points. So people with Asperger's who rely strongly on their cognitive abilities to think through situations, if you get too anxious or too angry, then thinking can be compromised and problem-solving abilities, can kind of go out the window. So, when you or someone you care about is really anxious or really angry, it's probably not the best time to be trying to problem solve or figure things out. And this is something that I think folks not on the spectrum don't understand and try to just intervene with people who are really stressed out and anxious and aren't at their best thinking and are expecting sort of better functioning. And, often what people will happen for folks on the spectrum is they'll have meltdowns like Hank talked about, or they might implode, sort of like there's sort of the exploders and the imploders. And so it's really important to know how to kind of cope with anxiety. It's not that you can eliminate it, but you need to be able to learn ways to cope with it. So so this is also something you can just do on your own, which is what do you notice about yourself when you begin to get anxious, both internally and externally, and what strategies do you use to manage anxiety? So, and we can at the end, if you want, you can certainly share about these during the question and answer period. So here are some strategies for decreasing anxiety. And, I'd love to hear, I'm sure people would love to hear some more from you guys out there. So using a special interest, just thinking about it. I know I had a group one time and people were pretty down, and we went around the room and everybody kind of just said what was something that they were really passionate about, that they were really interested in. And it immediately kind of lifted the mood. Because people could sort of go there. I've talked about the memory, incredible memory. And so using that special interest, thinking about it or carrying something with you. I know that Dan Aykroyd, who many of you probably know who he is, comedian, actor, was on Saturday Night Live, Blues Brothers. Anyway, he also has been diagnosed with Asperger Syndrome. And he's really into law enforcement, and he carries a police badge with him. And it just calms him down. He just likes it, makes him feel more comfortable. So whatever it takes, as long as it's legal, that's kind of important. So breathing obviously is really helpful, but hard to remember to do when you're anxious or angry. Taking a break with the purpose being to relax and to think and just to settle down, to get away from whatever is stressing you. So it's hard to anticipate when you need to take a break, but trying to be aware of that. Maybe build them in if you don't know that if you think you're not going to be able to tune in to when you're upset, then just build in the breaks. Exercise can really help people. These are not, this isn't rocket science here. These are pretty standard things, but, having, squishy balls or fidgets or something like that may also help. Cognitive behavioral therapy is an approach to therapy which can be really helpful because it uses your sort of thinking abilities and not so much, how do you feel about that kind of thing. It's more about challenging sort of cognitive distortions and strategizing for ways to think about things in stressful situations. Positive self-talk can also be helpful. Affirmations, I can do this, kind of talking yourself through things. Checking things out with a trusted person. That's something that may be hard for folks on the spectrum because it means, really reaching out to other people. But that's something, if you have questions about something or anxious about something, it's good to have one or two people you can check it out with and see if it makes sense to them and, just kind of talk it through with them. Animals, there's so many people that love animals. So spending time with a pet can just help so much with decreasing anxiety. Meditation helps for a lot of folks, and pairing a picture of a special interest with a helpful message. If there's someone that you like or something that you like, and you can just kind of put a message like you can do it or whatever message is going to work for you. This you can do it messages sometimes really bug people, but whatever's going to do it for you. Like I've done this before, I can do it this time. And so just remember, this is, a couple of the takeaways, controlling sensory inputs, or noticing them, just being aware of the sensory inputs that you're kind of up against, you're experiencing every day. So controlling sensory inputs and anxiety will lead to an increased ability to process, to think, and interact with the world around you, and to enjoy life. These are a few things I also want to point out. So a few red flags. So if someone says to you, as a person on the spectrum, come on, it'll be fun, that's probably a red flag that you ought to think about whether or not, you want to do that. It's like going to a party or an amusement park or something spontaneous or unplanned. It might be fun. And, I certainly recommend, going ahead and trying things, but it may be that, it's not always your thing. And, so just being aware that doing something spontaneously, may or may not work for you. If someone says to you, or you say to someone else, oh, it's just common sense, well, it may not make logical sense. And that may be sort of a red flag, like, oh, this might need to be explained because it might not make sense. This is a very bright person who might not get this particular thing. And then sometimes no means I just need more time to think about it. So a lot of times people on the spectrum will respond to requests to do something like, hey, let's go to let's go out to eat. Let's go to a party or whatever. And no may mean no, and no may mean you just sort of, kind of threw that at me. I wasn't expecting it, and I need more time to think about it and process it. And I think for folks not on the spectrum, they hear that no and they always say no. Well, that may be the only thing they can kind of muster, in that moment. So briefly on disclosure. So why disclose? It depends what the situation is, who you're talking to, who needs to know what and why is really important. So it's kind of nuanced. But the reason too is so that people don't reach their own erroneous conclusions. People will make assumptions about behaviors, and sometimes it's helpful to say, I'm really sensitive to fluorescent lights, so I might be a little on edge. That's a disclosure. That's not saying I have Asperger syndrome. And there's nothing wrong with actually saying I have Asperger syndrome. It's just that if you say that, the person may say, oh, I know what that is. My nephew has Asperger syndrome. And you may be nothing like their nephew. So you want to sort of control kind of what it is that people understand by giving them the information you want them to have. But it is helpful to tell people, especially like in a job interview or something, if you don't make great eye contact, you might even say, I'm not great at eye contact, but boy, am I going to do a great job here. And let me tell you why. Because people are going to notice it and be thinking like, what's up with this person? And if you sort of address it directly, then it takes it off the table. And then they might listen to why you might do such a great job. It's also important if you're going to request reasonable accommodations on the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. You need to disclose actually a disability. Everybody you work with doesn't have to know. HR has to know, or your supervisor might need to know. But you can't request accommodations if you don't also sort of say why you need them. But as I said, the disclosure can be strategic. It's really up to you to decide, when you want to, and it's not that it's shameful. It's just that, people don't share all of their details about their lives all the time. So it's really your information to decide how you want to share it and to whom and when. But you can do it piecemeal, as I said, and hopefully using what we talked about today, sensory and anxiety and executive functioning. Those are the pieces of things that people will need to know who you're interacting with. And this is just I feel like we're sort of moving into a new era. So these are pictures of autistic self-advocates. On the top right is Stephen Shore, who we started out with. The quote by him, and he's, teaching a student, and he's really opened doors. I mean, he and Temple Grandin, are two people who've been on the scene for a very long time. They were both diagnosed in childhood as being autistic. And, they have just opened doors for other folks here. Ari Ne'eman here on the left, who's the founder and president of ASAN, which is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. He's the first openly autistic presidential appointee. He's on the National Council on Disability, and I think he's about 26 right now, and he's founded ASAN right after he graduated high school. On the right here, Lydia Brown is a senior at Georgetown University. She's got a blog, Autistic Hoya. They are just, Ari and Lydia are doing incredible work. They're doing cross-disability work. I mean, they see, it's not just about autism and Asperger's. It's about, all people with differences and disabilities that deserve a right in a seat at the table. And so, look them up. They're great. But these are just some other folks on the bottom with our soon-to-be former Governor Deval Patrick, is Michael Wilcox, who is also an autistic self-advocate, diagnosed in his 60s. He's also, just incredible and out there and making a difference. Rudy Simone wrote Aspergers and a number of other books, diagnosed in her 40s. John Elder Robeson, who's written several books, is also diagnosed in his late 40s. And, they're all sort of embracing and making sense of what Asperger's and autism is in their lives and moving forward with it. And so I hope that, and this book on the top, Ask and Tell, is about disclosure. It's edited by Stephen Shore and Phil Schwartz, and lots of disclosure stories in there. So anyway, I think we can now sort of open it up to questions, but thank you all for being here virtually, and I hope you're still here. And let's open it up to questions. We've got a little bit of time.
We did have a couple people start sending in some questions.
Yeah.
So the first one here is, my husband projects his difficulties on me and can't see that he has these difficulties. How can I help him? We have been married almost 15 years, and he hasn't been able to understand me or communicate with me for that entire time. I want to know how to adapt myself so that we can communicate. Do you have any tips on how I can help him understand what I'm really saying, besides the words which he misinterprets?
I guess I want to. There's a lot there. I guess I would want to start by. It sounds like I'm not sure if he knows that you think he's on the spectrum or not. But I guess regardless of that, I would say focusing on the sensory and the anxiety, being aware of, so I think a lot of times for spouses and partners, picking the right time to talk, making sure that it's not right when somebody walks in from work at the end of the day, that it needs to be a time when someone can process information. As we talked about, Tony Atwood, if you're anxious or angry or certainly feeling, accused of things, the ability to communicate is not going to be very good. So I think, it's also, you probably want to get some support for yourself. But I think, again, just understanding the components of Asperger's and autism, what might be contributing to the challenges in the communication, and then trying to address some of those things that are contributing, like the sensory issues or anxiety. It's really hard. It's really hard for people not to blame each other. Doesn't matter whether you're on the spectrum or not. Disagreements are difficult, and blame is really easy. So I think if you can get some help, either separately for yourselves or together as a couple, we have actually an online spouse support group. And I don't know where you're located, but we have in-person couples groups. And sometimes we Have we done a webinar? We've done a
Mhm.
couples webinar.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think stay tuned. I mean, I don't
think
know if
in
he's
January
open to it.
we're
In
having-
January, we're having, okay. Yeah. So it's complicated. I don't mean to make it sound simple. It's not simple, but having the knowledge is really, really key. And you know, we're here at AANE to speak with people on the phone privately about their situation. Sometimes it takes us a while to get back, so if people have had to wait for calls from us, I'm sorry, but we do get back. So you can always call Adult Services, and we can refer you or talk to you ourselves. There were some questions that came in before. There was a question, and I'll try to sort of summarize, but it was. I've been told some women on the spectrum have unique psychic gifts. What can be said about this, and how common is it? Or is that sort of sixth sense due to very careful survival skill while trying to make sense of others, and looking for resources about that? So I guess my response to that is I don't really know about sort of psychic gifts, but I actually kind of wouldn't be surprised that, you know, anecdotally, yes, people on the spectrum are so tuned in and to sensory and other things in the environment that it wouldn't be surprising that they'd pick up on other things. I don't know, you know, sort of in terms of beyond that, I'm not really sure. But Rudy Simone, who is the person who wrote Aspergers, and many other books, is apparently doing some thinking about that. So it might be good to get in touch with Rudy Simone about that. And were there other questions that you wanted to
have a few? Yep. So another one is we move around. I'm sorry, I have to go back and find questions. So this is another spouse. I really need to declutter and pick up our home, but he has an anxiety attack when I change the simplest thing, including picking up a room. Do you have any tips on how I can do this without causing him to have anxiety?
Again, I mean, I think it just goes back to the communication piece. Is there a space that, you know, can be his space, that you don't need to pick up, that can be, you know, as cluttered as, you know, he either wants it to be or that he can't help. You know, again, I think getting outside help to try to figure that out. Sometimes people work with coaches versus therapists to try to work on that. I've heard some people work with family coaches. And yes, change is going to be stressful and hard. And that's part of being in a relationship. I'm not going to come up with any sort of easy answers here. Just try to talk about it in a non-stressful time. I feel like I'm coming up with the same answers. Do we have some questions from adults also?
How do you get diagnosed as an adult in another state?
So give us a call or send an email. And our contact information for adult services is here. We can try to direct you to someone in your state that may be available to diagnose adults. We don't have exhaustive resources in other states, but I'm not sure which state you're in, but we can try to direct you. Sometimes I tell people, you know, network with the people that are diagnosing the kids. You never know, they might be actually also seeing adults, but just not advertising it. You're right, it's important to go to somebody that actually knows what Asperger's or autism looks like in adults, because a lot of people will go and not get the diagnosis because they've learned so many compensatory strategies. So they go in and, you know, see a neuropsychologist and they say, you aren't on the spectrum, you know, you have eye contact, you have friends, you know, you're functional, you have a job. And, you know, the adult says, you don't know what this has taken out of me to get to this point, to be able to function like this. And sometimes they don't get the diagnosis. So, it also depends why you want to get the diagnosis. Sometimes people are content to be self-diagnosed. You know, they do a lot of reading themselves, and sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I went for a second opinion to a doctor, but really, I was the first one who kind of diagnosed it." People do need to get diagnosed if you want to get benefits like Social Security, or, other, if you vocational rehab, that kind of thing, you do have to have a diagnosis of some sort. But anyway, it's best to just, understand what are your strengths, what are your challenges, how are you wired, and, how you approach the world.
Another question was, actually a couple of these questions, about adult relationships, building romantic relationships. Is it possible, and especially when they know they have and struggle with these differences?
Okay, so is it possible
to have those types of relationships?
Oh, yeah.
And then, even though there's struggle with that.
Yes. So, yes, people clearly have a lot of challenges. Some people have a lot of challenges with having relationships. It's really hard to even know how to meet people, and how to maintain a relationship, and what your role is in a relationship. So, again, it goes back to, trying to find people who are going to be into similar things that you are. So Tony Atwood talks about, the kinds of relationships that really seem to work are the ones where people are with people who are somewhat similar to them, so also on the spectrum or near the spectrum, kind of similar, or people who are with what he calls extreme neurotypicals. So people that are, socially incredible and organized and all that kind of thing. It's a lot of work. There are a lot of books out there. Again, Rudy Simone has some good relationship books. There are lots of books out there by folks who, one of the best ones I think recent is the Journal of Best Practices by David Finch. It's David and Kristen Finch are a married couple. He was also diagnosed as an adult. And there's lots of tips in there about how to have a successful relationship. It's not easy. It's work for anyone. And the other thing is, there's a lot of sensory issues. If people don't like to be touched, but someone else that they're in a relationship really, really likes to be touched, then that's going to be hard, and it's going to be something that you have to work out. That is the kind of thing that people do in couples therapy. Again, if you're going to see a therapist, they need to understand the spectrum, because otherwise they won't really respond necessarily appropriately. They won't interpret what's going on in the relationship. So it's important that that someone is aware that Asperger's or autism is part of the picture. Again, it's more complicated, but you can always call us.
Okay, so another coupled question: How do I not get angry when people misunderstand what I'm saying? Often I insult people or come off as rude.
Okay, so how do I not get angry? Can I just see it? I'm a little visual myself.
Yeah, no, it's just repeated over and over again, but it's really here. How do I not get? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess if you can give people a break and sort of understand that, okay, they may not always understand me. I may be saying things in a way that's atypical. And I think it's partly expecting that, like, if you can tell yourself before you say something to, interact with people and say, okay, sometimes people get misunderstand me. Often people misunderstand me, and just try to anticipate it so that you don't just react. It's really hard. And you don't want to come off as rude and insult people. I think, part of it is, if you recognize that happens, then you can say, I'm sorry, I have a hard time. I feel like I'm being misunderstood, and I have a hard time when that happens. That's a reason to do a little bit of a disclosure, not in the moment. If it's a calmer time and you can kind of say, you know what, in a calmer time, just really say, like, sometimes I really, when I'm a little stressed, I think people misunderstand me, or people do misunderstand me, and maybe I'm not communicating clearly enough. But I just want to let you know I'm trying, and if we can just keep working at it. Communication is a lot of work, and so I think that question may go back to needing to do a little bit of a disclosure, possibly preemptively, if that's possible, which of course it's not always possible. But again, I feel like it all goes back again to self-understanding, self-advocacy, knowing the components, knowing, what's impacting you in a particular environment at a particular time with a particular group of people. It's a lot of work. That's why it's so exhausting, because it has to be in cognitively, and it's not just natural. And also try not to be too hard on yourself if you have those reactions, and know that you will learn from it, that over time it may not continue to happen in the same way.
Yes, I think we're right at 11:30. So I would say if anyone else has additional questions, to feel free to contact us here, and we can be a little bit more specific. And I will be.
Okay, so thank you all so